My parents sold our family house because of their golden child's debt. When my parents sat me down and asked if I could give them a small loan from my savings, I genuinely thought they were joking. But when I saw the desperation in their eyes, I knew they weren't. They had sold our family home to bail out my brother, the golden child, from his massive debt, and now they were broke. And they wanted me, the responsible one, to fix everything. Growing up, I'd always known that my older brother Mark was the favourite. He was charismatic, good-looking, and charming, the type of person who could get away with anything. I, on the other hand, was the studious, quiet one who followed the rules. While Mark basked in our parents' constant praise and attention, I worked hard in silence, never expecting much from them. Now, years later, it felt like nothing had changed. Mark had racked up an enormous amount of debt due to his reckless spending and failed business ventures. Instead of holding him accountable, my parents sold the home we grew up in to save him. They didn't even ask me how I felt about it or consider how much that home meant to me. And now they were back, asking for more, not from Mark, but from me. "We wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious," my mum said, her voice wavering. "You've done so well for yourself. You're the only one who can help us." Her words felt like a slap in the face. I'd done well for myself because I worked tirelessly, sacrificing vacations, luxuries, and even sleep to build my career and savings. Meanwhile, Mark had been handed everything on a silver platter and still managed to destroy it all. And now, they wanted me to pay the price for their poor decisions and his failures. I clenched my fists, holding back the torrent of emotions threatening to spill out. It was time to confront the truth. My parents' favoritism had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure I could forgive them this time. Growing up, the favoritism wasn't glaringly obvious, not at first. When we were kids, my parents tried to make it seem like they treated Mark and me equally. But looking back now, I can see the signs were always there. Mark was the golden boy of our family from the very beginning. He was the firstborn, the miracle baby my parents had struggled to conceive for years. By the time I came along, 3 years later, their excitement over parenthood had dimmed a little. Not that they didn't love me. But with Mark, everything he did was extraordinary, while I was just me. When we were kids, my mum would proudly show off Mark's artwork on the fridge, even though it was just scribbles. My drawings, which my teacher said were quite advanced for my age, were never displayed. If Mark aced a spelling test, there was ice cream and celebrations. When I brought home straight A's, it was barely acknowledged. As we got older, the favoritism became harder to ignore. Mark was charming and extroverted, always surrounded by friends and the centre of attention at family gatherings. I was quieter, more reserved, and preferred reading or working on school projects to being in the spotlight. My parents chalked it up to a personality difference and used it to justify their behaviour. "Mark just needs more attention." My mum would say, "You're so independent. You'll be fine on your own." Fine on my own. I was still a child, yet I was expected to be the responsible one, while Mark got away with everything. When Mark wanted to join a travel soccer team in middle school, my parents moved heaven and earth to make it happen. They paid for uniforms, expensive gear, and out-of-state tournaments without blinking an eye. When I wanted to take piano lessons, they said it was too expensive. In high school, it got worse. Mark struggled with his grades, constantly needing tutors and extra help, which my parents gladly paid for. Meanwhile, I maintained a 4.0 GPA entirely on my own. When I asked for help with SAT prep classes, my dad said, "You're smart enough, you don't need it." And then there was college. Mark barely graduated high school, but my parents still pushed him to go to an expensive university out of state, insisting that it would help him find his potential. They paid his tuition, housing, and even sent him extra money every month to stay comfortable. He flunked out after 2 years. I, on the other hand, earned a partial scholarship to a state school and worked 2 part-time jobs to cover the rest. My parents gave me some support, but it was a fraction of what they spent on Mark. When I asked why, my mum said, "We know you'll figure it out. Mark needs more help right now." Mark's failures were always excused. When he dropped out of college, my dad said, "Not everyone's meant for school. He'll find his path." When he ran up thousands of dollars in credit card debt after college, my mum said, "He's still learning how to manage money. It's a process." Meanwhile, I was expected to have everything together. No one asked how I was doing balancing school, work, and life. When I mentioned feeling stressed or overwhelmed, the response was always the same. You're so strong, you'll get through it. After college, Mark jumped from one failed venture to another. He tried starting a marketing agency with no experience, bought a luxury car he couldn't afford, and even got involved in some shady, get-rich-quick schemes. My parents bailed him out every time. He's trying, my mum would say. At least he's ambitious. I wasn't ambitious. I'd worked my way up from an entry-level position to a management role within a few years, yet my accomplishments were barely acknowledged. When I bought my first car with my own money, my dad said, "It's not as nice as Mark's, but good for you." Never mind that Mark's car had been repossessed by that point. The breaking point came a few years ago when Mark started a business with a friend who turned out to be a scam artist. He lost tens of thousands of dollars, most of which had come from my parents. They had taken out a second mortgage on the family home to give him the money. I found out about it when my mom casually mentioned they were cutting back on vacations to make ends meet. When I pressed her, she admitted what they had done. I was furious. "He's your son," she said defensively. "We couldn't just let him fail." And now, years later, they had finally run out of options. Mark had racked up even more debt, this time from gambling, and they were forced to sell the family home to cover it. I only found out after the sale was final. When I confronted my parents, my mom tried to justify it. "We thought it would be better if you didn't know," she said. "We didn't want you to worry." Not worry? They had sold the house I grew up in, the house that held every memory of my childhood, to save my brother from his own stupidity. And now, they were asking me to hand over my savings to help them recover from their latest bad decision. Mark, of course, was unapologetic. "It's not my fault," he said when I called him out. "Mom and Dad wanted to help. They didn't have to sell the house." That was the moment I realized just how deep their favoritism ran. It wasn't just about loving him more. It was about enabling him, no matter the cost. And I was done, paying the price. When I found out the house was sold, I felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. This wasn't just a house. It was our home. It was the backdrop of every significant moment in my life. Every birthday, every Christmas morning, every scraped knee that Mum patched up in the kitchen. It all happened there. The news didn't come from my parents. No, I learned about it through a neighbour who casually mentioned how sorry they were to see our family leave. Confused, I called my mom. She hesitated for a moment before blurting out, "Oh yes, we sold the house. It was the only way to help your brother." The only way? They didn't even tell me they were considering selling it. No discussion, no warning, just a cold final decision that affected all of us, but was made entirely for Mark's benefit. I drove to their new place, a much smaller house in a less desirable neighbourhood, to confront them. When I walked through the door, it didn't even feel like a home. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched. It was a far cry from the warm, cosy house I grew up in. "How could you do this without telling me?" I asked, barely able to keep the anger out of my voice. My dad sighed, rubbing his temples like he was the one who had been wronged. "We didn't think you needed to know," he said. "You're doing fine on your own. This was about helping Mark. He's your brother." That phrase again, "he's your brother." As if that was supposed to justify everything. "You sold our home for his gambling debts?" I snapped. "Do you even hear how insane that sounds?" My mum stepped in, her voice trembling. "It's not just about the debt. Mark's been struggling. He's had a tough time finding his footing. We're his parents. We couldn't just abandon him." Abandon him? That was rich coming from the people who had essentially abandoned me emotionally my entire life. "So what about me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What about the memories tied to that house? What about the stability I deserved just as much as he did?" My dad waved me off. "You're strong. You've always been strong. Mark's not like you. He needs more help." I was sick of hearing that excuse. It wasn't just about strength. It was about accountability. Mark had been given chance after chance, and he squandered every single one. Meanwhile, I had worked tirelessly to build a stable life for myself, and now I was supposed to just sit back and watch everything I cared about be sacrificed for him. The real kicker came when Mark showed up halfway through the conversation. He strolled in like he didn't, wearing designer sneakers and carrying a Starbucks cup. He looked at me and smirked. "Hey sis," he said, casually. "Did Mum and Dad tell you the good news? I'm debt-free now." Debt-free? He said it like he had achieved something monumental, as if our parents' sacrifices were a victory for him. "You're unbelievable," I spat. "Do you even feel guilty about what they had to do for you?" He shrugged. "They wanted to help. It's not my fault." That was the moment I realized Mark wasn't just enabled by my parents. He genuinely believed he was entitled to their help. He saw no problem with taking and taking without ever giving anything in return. My parents, of course, jumped to his defense. "Don't be so harsh on your brother," my mum said, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "He's been through enough." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "And what about me?" I asked, turning to face her. "Do I ever get to be the one who's been through enough? Or is that privilege reserved for Mark?" They didn't have an answer. The following weeks were a blur of emotions: anger, sadness, disbelief. Every time I thought about the house, my chest tightened. It wasn't just the loss of a physical space, it was the loss of a symbol, a foundation, a place where I had felt safe and rooted. I drove by the house once after it was sold. A new family was moving in, their kids playing in the yard where I used to play. I felt a pang of jealousy and grief. That was supposed to be my legacy. Meanwhile, Mark continued living his life as if nothing had happened. He posted pictures on social media of himself at fancy restaurants and on weekend trips with friends. It was clear he hadn't learned a single lesson from the ordeal. As for my parents, they tried to pretend everything was fine, but I could see the cracks forming. Downsizing hadn't solved their financial problems. It had only delayed them. The money from the house sale was running out faster than they had anticipated, and they were starting to feel the strain. Every time I visited their new house, it felt more suffocating. My mum would drop hints about how hard things were, how they missed the old house, but had no choice. My dad would mutter about rising costs and how family should stick together in tough times. It was only a matter of time before they turned to me, and when they finally did, I wasn't sure how I would handle it. It didn't take long for the reality of their decision to sink in. Selling the house was supposed to solve everything, but the aftermath was far from the relief they had imagined. The downsized home was smaller than anything they had been accustomed to, and the money from the sale didn't last as long as they thought it would. My parents didn't say it outright, but I could tell they had underestimated how much it would cost to maintain their new lifestyle. They had been relying on the money from the house to support their retirement and their daily expenses. But with rising bills and the strain of adjusting to a smaller space, it became clear they were in trouble. One evening, I received a call from my dad. He wasn't his usual jovial self. "We need to talk," he said, his tone weary and strained. The moment I stepped into their living room, I could sense the heaviness in the air. My dad was sitting at the kitchen table, his elbows on the wood, his hands clasped in front of him. My mum stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression tight. "We don't want to put this on you," my dad started. "But we're in a tough spot. We thought we had enough to make it, but we didn't take into account some of the things we would need to cover." My stomach churned. "What do you need from me?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "We've been getting by," my mum added, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we need your help. Just a loan. It's a temporary thing, we promise. It's for the bills, the house, the things we didn't plan for." I tried to hold back, the disbelief rising inside me. The house was gone, sold to pay off my brother's debts, and now they wanted me to cover their living expenses. They had spent years enabling my brother's reckless behavior, and now they were asking me to step in and clean up the mess. "You've done so well for yourself," my dad continued, the pride in his voice unmistakable. "We wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." I felt the sting of their words. My parents saw me as their financial savior, as the responsible one, who could always be counted on to step up. But they had never once acknowledged that I had sacrificed everything to get to where I was. I had worked 2 jobs throughout college, skipped vacations, and avoided indulgences just to make sure I could be financially independent. And now, They wanted me to bail them out. I've worked so hard to build my savings, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the flood of emotions rising inside me. I didn't get here by handing money over to you whenever you needed it. Why don't you ask Mark for help? He's the one who got you into this mess. My mum's face paled, and my dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, he's not in a position to help right now, my mum said, clearly uncomfortable. He's working on getting his life together, but it's not going to be immediate. But you'll still expect me to bail you out now, won't you? I thought, but I didn't say it aloud. Instead, I sat there, feeling the weight of their expectations press down on me. The conversation didn't end that night. I couldn't just let it go. I had to confront them, to let them know how unfair this entire situation was. I had sacrificed so much to get ahead, and now they wanted me to sacrifice my hard-earned savings too. The next day, I called my parents and asked if we could talk. This time, it was just me, my mum, and my dad. No distractions, no sugarcoating. I can't believe you're asking me to help after everything that's happened. I began, my voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. You sold the house, the one place I had left to pay off Mark's debt, and now you're asking me to hand over my savings to help you, after everything. My mum's eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't swayed. You've always favoured him, Mom. Always. You've let him make mistake after mistake, and now you're expecting me to pick up the pieces. She shook her head, trying to defend herself. He's your brother. He needed us, and we were just doing what we thought was right. But what about me? I shot back, my voice rising. What about everything I've done to keep this family afloat? Where was my support when I needed it? My dad didn't say much during the exchange, but his silence spoke volumes. He looked at me like I was being unreasonable, like I was the one in the wrong for not wanting to give up my savings. You're being too hard on your mother, he muttered. She was just trying to help. That's when I lost it. Help! You've been enabling him his entire life, and now you expect me to clean up the mess? I stormed out of their house, leaving my parents behind. I knew they wouldn't understand. They had chosen Mark, time and time again. It wasn't about family anymore. It was about picking favourites, enabling toxic behaviour, and ignoring the person who had always done things the right way. I didn't change my mind. I stood firm. I wasn't going to let them guilt-trip me into sacrificing everything I'd worked for just to save their sorry situation. I told them, in no uncertain terms, that I would not be lending them money. I love you both, but I can't keep bailing you out. I have my own future to think about, and I'm not going to sacrifice everything for someone who doesn't appreciate it. They tried to guilt me into helping, of course. My mum cried. My dad looked disappointed, but I didn't budge. For the first time in my life, I put myself first. The fallout was swift and painful. They didn't talk to me for weeks, and when they did, it was cold and distant. My mom even accused me of being selfish, but I didn't care anymore. I had made my peace with my decision. I wasn't going to let their mistakes define my life. My savings were mine, and my future was mine to protect. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the guilt, free from the manipulation, and free from the years of living in my brother's shadow.